What's up, guys? Coming at you from Shenzhen, China, as usual, with some sad news, of course, with Li Wen Liang, the doctor who discovered the coronavirus, or at least identified it as something SARS-like, has passed away last night from coronavirus. And, there was an initial announcement that he passed away, I think, just before midnight. And that's when the comments started pouring in from netizens in China, just really angry at the government. Because, of course, when he was alerting people in his WeChat groups, he was reprimanded. He wasn't arrested, but he was reprimanded and told basically to keep quiet. And so people are obviously very, very upset by that. And then there was news later on that he was actually in ICU and there still was a chance. So a lot of people here in China, they stayed up, including my wife, just waiting for the news and hoping. And then I can't remember the exact time. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. He finally did pass away. So there's a lot of questions the government needs to answer here, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, in terms of wet markets, 100%, I can tell you that they're gonna, when they crack down on that, anybody whose life or business relies on wet markets or are involved in wet markets in any capacity, their lives are going to become very, very difficult. But what about censorship? Is there going to be a discussion in the government about censorship and how it works? I think there should be. I don't know if there will be. And personally, what I think should be done is I think there should be way more transparency to censorship. And I know that sounds a bit like an oxymoron, but what is transparent censorship? But the thing that you've got to wonder, and this is why we have to wonder because it's not transparent, is how many times has there been a doctor who got it wrong, or somebody who wanted to fearmonger, or somebody who had something to sell? How many times has that happened where the government censored them, cut it short, and basically prevented people from all over China panicking or somebody profiting for selfish reasons or for no reason at all? And we don't know. We have no idea. We, of course, know the time when it failed, and it failed miserably this time. And that's one of the reasons I think that we've reached a point. There's a guy I really respect, Li Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, or the father of Singapore, as they call him. He always had some really interesting ideas and thoughts on the benchmarks that a society needs to reach before certain freedoms are put in place, whether it be freedom of speech or democracy and all this stuff. And he had some good debates with Chris Patton on this also. And I think we've reached that point in China. I think we've reached the point where people are pretty darn educated here. Some people are they're getting their news through VPN anyways. So I think we've reached the point where there needs to be some sort of transparency. I don't know how that manifests itself, whether it's at the end of the year, there's a report saying, these are the things we censored, these are the rumors we censored, and this is why. And people can kind of figure it out for themselves. It would create a lot more trust. Of course, there's this idea that there should be no censorship at all. And this is coming from people in the West who think they don't have censorship. And that's, of course, not the case. I mean, even with, for example, like my video where I mentioned YouTube demonetized all coronavirus videos to discourage people from making content on it because there's just too many people putting a lot of really questionable or BS claims out there, or just want to profit off of the ad revenues also, something along the lines of that. So they just demonetized everyone. And the word I didn't use in that video was soft censorship. And the reason I didn't use it, even though it is soft censorship, is that I wanted to see how many people took an issue with it. If the same number of people took an issue with it that take an issue with censorship in China. And there wasn't. People were just like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And I don't know why that is. I don't know why if they don't think about it as censorship, or it's like because it's on their side, they're not going to be as critical about it. Or I don't know. There was one person who says, I don't feel really comfortable about it, but not too many people. So we do live under censorship. It, of course, goes way further than that. And we just kind of fall in line every time. With one exception, actually. This might take me off topic a little bit, but I remember when there was a drone strike on Saudi Arabia oil facilities. And there was a group in Yemen who took responsibility for it. They said, we did this because of what you're doing with our government here, and these are our demands, and we're going to keep doing it. And then the US reshifted it towards Iran and said this was an Iran attack. And I was really surprised because there were so many people when that article came out that they were like, yeah, right, US. Even Americans, they were like, we've seen this before, like new weapons of mass destruction, or it very much looked like they were starting to create an excuse to do something. But then that kind of disappeared. That sentiment disappeared. And when they killed Soleimani, which was correct, they were preparing for something, they were all just like, yeah, all right, cool. All of those people had forgotten how to critically think again. And then the censorship piece came in when, for example, the president of Syria wanted to speak up about it and give his take on the events, particularly because Soleimani was on his way to Iraq to have peace talks with Saudi Arabia. It could have been a very, very important meeting. It could have, created more peace or destabilized the situation over there. And that's when the U.S. decided to basically assassinate him, right? So what did Twitter do? They removed him off. They removed the president of Syria off. And then Facebook came out with something also saying, in order to comply with U.S. sanctions, we are going to be removing certain people off of our platform, and even people who sympathize with them. It's like, how's that for controlling the global narrative? And there's so many more things I could mention about that, but I'm risking going way too far off topic. But we live under censorship in the West, and granted, not to the same level they do here. But I think those milestones that Lee Kuan Yew was talking about, I think a lot of them might have been met. And I think it's I think we've reached a point where if the government doesn't open up a little bit more about how these mechanisms work, it becomes a little bit patronizing. And there's a lot of really good explanations for how it works and how it protects people. I mean, the one thing that a lot of people like to focus on in the comments or in international media is religious freedoms, and they say that that's an example of censorship, is they censor the ability for religions to really anybody to be religious here, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There's 25,000 mosques here. I have a friend here in Shenzhen, Han Chinese, who goes to church, and I asked him, because I used to go to church when I was a kid, if they send a collection plate around. He says, come to think of it, I've never seen that. When he goes overseas, he goes to churches also, and there's a collection plate. But he said, yeah, actually, there's no collection plate. The government actually provides everything they need. And however, if you post something like really rude about a religion or something really false about Islam or something like that, that oftentimes will get removed off of the internet here. So here you have the censorship doing the opposite of what you think it's supposed to do. It's censorship to protect religions. So religious freedoms are protected in the most authentic way here. However, if you want to say, does China have religious freedoms across a broad definition of it, like we have? Like we are allowed to, especially back in the 80s and 90s, we had a lot of this. We are allowed to have televangelists go on TV and touch people's foreheads and say, "You are healed," and they get out of their walkers or they say, "Oh, their tumor is gone now from their stomach," and all this kind of BS to earn money. No, that's not going to be allowed here. There's no way you're going to be able to get somebody to go on TV here and take advantage of the sick, weak, or mentally challenged. And thank goodness for that. I mean, especially with a new society that's just opening up, just opening up to the outside more, they would be particularly vulnerable to be taken advantage of people like that. And so if you want to say that there's no religious freedoms in a broad sense because we can't do that, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're not going to have a situation like Jim Jones, who I think he was in San Diego, but he took that group of people down to Guyana, which is my mother's country, and convinced nearly 1,000 people to commit suicide in the name of religion. No, you're not going to get that here, and that's why, if you want to say based on that measurement, there's no religious freedom here. And if you're disappointed in that, and we're on two different wavelengths here. But back to my original point, what has happened here has shown that regardless of how many times it went right, when it goes wrong, it can go spectacularly wrong. Now we have a massive crisis on our hands, and this needs to create some sort of reflection from the government here. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but one time is too much. Even if 100 times they manage to prevent panic, the gravity of what's happened here with this doctor who is appropriately being hailed as a hero by the people shows that there needs to be some sort of a transparency or some better mechanisms in place to handle this, and even start opening up a bit more. There's of course a concern about opening up because when China's being targeted by foreign powers out of fear of them becoming the next kind of global power, obviously having a certain level of openness is also a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability for the U.S. to come in and kind of I want to say U.S. because there's documented history of them doing this. Like, I'll give you an example, even before the internet, going back to actually my mom's country, the example. When they elected their first president, Cheddi Jagan, the U.S. didn't like him because he was a little bit too friendly with the Soviet Union, and they didn't want another Cuba situation. So basically they went in and they created a campaign to create a racial war between the blacks and the Indians in Guyana. And those are declassified documents from the MI5 and CIA. They're available online. That's exactly what they did. And then they used it as an excuse to suspend Parliament and replace him with somebody who magically wasn't very pro-Soviet Union at that point. So these are the kinds of things, and there has been a lot of speculation and indication that some of the terrorism that was going on in China before with the Muslim extremists was artificial. I mean, that's a topic I've got to do another video on. The topic of censorship I have to do a whole separate longer video on, but I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes. But with the that's one of the key points where Facebook was banned in China, because when we had all that terrorism problem in China, there were groups that were kind of cooperating and arranging their plans on Facebook groups. And the Chinese government had reached out to them to censor it, to close those groups down. And they said, no, it doesn't work here like that. And they said, okay, well, we'll just block the whole thing. Now, granted, they might have still blocked Facebook anyways, but that was an important pivotal point. And they even went as far as blocking the images of what these terrorists were doing in China, because there were some terrible videos of them, these Muslim extremists slicing people up in the Kunming subway or driving their car through crowds of people. Those images were all censored in China. They've since been declassified, and they're available even on YouTube now, and they're pretty scary. But what did that do? That's also a kind of censorship. And that was a censorship that prevented a lot of backlash. I mean, if you were to compare that, for example, to 9/11, of course you can't censor the images of the buildings coming down and stuff like that, but managing the way that the conversation happened after probably would have been a valuable tool, considering how many mosques had arson attacks against them in North America after that, how many Muslims were bullied, or even people with brown skin in general. Like there was a Sikh man who was killed because he was mistaken as a Muslim. And you imagine that happening here with a population of over 1 billion people. So they use these mechanisms to protect people in a lot of ways. And that actually makes me think of another example before I forget, because I covered the topic of religion, and some people might think, well, are they really allowed to practice their religion in their own true, authentic way? So an argument against that is that, or to kind of say that that's somewhat true, is that with religions here in China, they're allowed to practice them, but as long as it doesn't encroach on the rights of others, whether it be others outside of their own group or even within their own group, like women. So China is one of the countries that bans the full coverings for women, Muslim women, because they see it as a sign of oppression. And you may be able to kind of dispute that or not, but you can see that working out in a practical way where they do prioritize the rights of women to the point where China is actually one of the very few countries in the world where there are women imams. They have a long history of it. And this is something you don't really see elsewhere. I think there's a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, that's very odd. So they go as far as making sure that marginalizing women within Islam doesn't happen, that it even created a pathway for them to become imams. So there's a bunch of other things to think about in terms of because I mentioned I brushed over the topic of censorship in one of my other videos, and I said a lot of people think about censorship in a one-dimensional way, and I didn't go into any more detail. So a lot of people are like, "Whoa, I can't believe you said that," and then they kind of just shut off from there. And this video isn't going to be comprehensive enough to talk about all of my ideas on censorship, but it starts to reveal some of the things that I will talk about in that longer video. But I think what the more important thing to do now and talk about now is what's happened here. Censorship messed up this time, and it's put us all at risk, and it's caused a major issue. I mean, even if it wasn't censored, well, there's two ways to look at this, right? And this way is slightly flawed. I sometimes do this to put things into perspective. I say that let's say this was a society and this problem came out in a place where there's no censorship whatsoever. And they say, we got a problem on our hands. There are most other countries, they wouldn't have the mechanisms to put in place to then control it. So we would very well be worse off than where we are now in a country that has full transparency but an inability to act like this. However, I don't want to focus on that too much, even though it's an important self-reflective thing to think about. The fact of the matter is, we do have that ability here to act on epic scales and react on epic scales. So he should have been able to get his information out earlier, and we should have done everything we're doing now much earlier. And we would all be at less risk now. All the people here, my family, me, it's my father-in-law I'm worried about most because he has an existing lung condition. We would all be at less of a risk had they listened to this guy, took him seriously, and done everything we're doing now sooner. Now, of course, there probably still is going to be a lag time to make sure that this really is a serious issue, or establish that there is a trend, establish how contagious it is, and that's not something that's going to be done immediately. Also, anyways, that's not something that's going to happen like that. But I think there's no way you can deny that by silencing this hero that we lost last night, we certainly lost valuable time. And I hope that's going to be enough of an epiphany for the government here to reflect as much on how censorship works here as they are about how wet markets are going to be here. I can tell you the wet market reforms, they're coming. Censorship reforms? I have no idea. That might be a little bit more of wishful thinking. But those are some of the things I just wanted to talk about. As usual, I probably missed a bunch of stuff. That's the nature of kind of going on the fly here. However, there's a bunch of things I touched on here that I am going to talk about in longer, more in-depth topics when I have the time to and when this is over, because the priority here is obviously elsewhere at the moment. Anyways, let me wrap this up here. We are way over the time I wanted to go over, and I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe, take all the precautions that you need to, and see you in the next video.
I wanted to finish the end of this video with a message for Li Wen Liang. You tried to warn us all, but you were shut down and had your life taken by the very thing you were trying to protect us from. You knew what the right thing to do was, but you were prevented from being able to do it. You have all the characteristics of someone who would have made wonderful contributions to society, but you've been taken away from us at such a young age of 34. You are recognized as a hero across China now, and the thoughts of so many of us are directed towards the rest of your family, including your pregnant wife who's still fighting coronavirus at this moment. I hope the positive energy from the wishes and prayers does somehow help, but spirituality and superstition, as some may call it, aside, there's one undeniable physical and practical thing we can take away from this: a need to reflect. I sincerely hope your departure was not in vain, and you become remembered as an important figure in China for the moment that it became even more self-reflective, a catalyst for the next stage of reforms to improve your country, and a way to make sure its future destined heroes don't get ignored. Great heroes don't fall from the heavens. They are born from ordinary people standing up. Rest in peace, Li Wen Liang.